we're really talking about a measurement problem that's kind of the same as the money problem, right? Which was a measurement problem, right?
Yeah.
If you're talking about inflation, you want to know the quantity of money, and the quantity of money is important in determining inflation, especially its relative position to economic conditions. But you don't know how to quantify or measure the quantity of money. It's the same thing. If you're inaccurately measuring the quantity of labor that's available to be used, you're going to be fooling yourself. So what is it that economists actually do here?
Wow. So
50
funny.
years of just essentially fooling themselves into believing they understand things that they don't.
This may speak to the proclivity of a lot of Austrian economists that they're very adverse to measurement and metrics in general. So they think that it can be misleading, which I guess this would be a great instance of that, this Phillips curve debacle.
Oh, and that's one of the banes of Austrian economists, is that, recognizing how stupid that was from the very beginning.
Yeah. And we're still relying on it today. Is that right?
It's gone through several different intellectual iterations where it's been, neo-Keynesian economists have claimed they've updated it, made it more accurate and more usable. And like I said, they use more inflation expectations instead of, just raw unemployment rate versus CPI, sorts of things like that. But by and large, again, as we said, if you don't know how to measure the thing you're attempting to control or exploit and manipulate,
right,
it's, garbage in, garbage out.
That's right.
The old programming.
I love Wittgenstein's ruler on this. As if you're trying to measure a table with a ruler, but you can't trust the ruler, you don't know if you're measuring the table or the ruler. You're in this domain of relativism. You can't figure anything out. So that's excellent point. So, and then when unemployment and inflation increased together, this was the infamous stagflation in the 70s.
Right. And this Friedman's argument was essentially that people would become sort of normalized to higher rates of inflation. So it wouldn't matter, the Phillips curve wouldn't apply because it would only apply in the short run. That long-term expectations actually determined rates of inflation as well as rates of unemployment, essentially because high levels of inflation tend to be not very good for economic conditions either. And if you become normalized to the one, you essentially become normalized to the other.
Incredible. And then,
and the thing was, nobody knew how to get out of it. It was sort of like, in 1970, August 15th, 1971, of course, Nixon closed the gold window, but that wasn't even his point. It was everything else in the Nixon. I mean, he sort of threw that in at the end. And by the way, nobody told the Fed about this. The Fed, supposedly the Fed's printing press, fiat currency, they were supposed to be set free on August 16th, 1971. Nobody at the Treasury told the Fed they were going to do this because nobody cared. The Fed wasn't even an important part of any of these things because at that time, the modern Fed that we all have an image of was essentially a recent fiction, a recent creation. Back then, the Fed was subservient to Treasury anyway. But by and large, Nixon in August of 71, closing the gold window was supposed to be a way for him to devalue the dollar and maybe get back on a gold exchange at some point in a time. But really, his idea was about essentially socialism, wage and price controls.
Wow.
Because they did not know how to break the inflationary paradigm. They didn't know how to get out of it because they didn't really understand what was going on in it. And that's why it was one thing after another, after another, after another, stretching out an entire 15 to 17 year period of just everybody sort of looking at each other and wondering, how the hell do we fix this? Because they didn't really understand the problem to begin with.
Wow. So, and this clearly gets out of control. And then it's Volcker that comes in and does something about this?
That's the legend. And that's where the expectations policy is born. The idea that Paul Volcker and a committed central bank can essentially do whatever it wants. If it says, I'm going to be an inflation fighter, then don't fight the Fed.
Yeah.
And the part that people always get wrong about that is that nobody really knows what Volcker did. It's like we just assume that Volcker ended the great inflation because he let the level of money rates go through the roof, and that provoked a double dip recession in the early 1980s. But what did he really do? Again, it's essentially the Fed trying to take credit for everything and subsuming it under this expectations policy where if we want to do something, we're going to be able to do it. If we want to break inflation, we're going to do it. And you don't fight the Fed because that's what's going on. But if you go back to the late 70s and early 1980s, while all this was going on, nobody was attributing the Fed much of anything. They were not saying, "Hey, Paul Volcker, our hero, let's give him a parade." It was sort of like, we don't really know what's happening. And by the middle 1980s, we didn't have another explanation for what's going on. So maybe it was Volcker. I mean,
wow,
it could have been anything, right?
So
I mean,
what happened?
Maybe it was. The Eurodollar system essentially broke. It got to a point where that early initial phase had gone too far. And in those recessions of 1980 and 1981, 82, it sort of reconstituted itself. It snapped back. And when we came out of it in the middle 1980s, it focused in other directions because all of the things that had happened during the 1970s great inflation, like the Latin debt crisis, for example, which was a big part of it, this global expansion of money, that was a bad place to be. So all of the stuff that the Eurodollar system did during the 1970s, the Eurodollar participants we can't do that stuff again. Let's try something else. And they went into essentially hyper financialization, where much of this balance sheet resources started to get dedicated into these even more esoteric financial forms like Eurodollar futures, interest rate swaps that became standardized in 1985, which ISDA got formed, which allowed the system to sort of go into a less real economy inflation, more asset type activities.
So it was these economic crises then that caused a drawdown in the Eurodollar expansion? Is that what corrected?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's what corrected
Latin
the
debt crisis was, for the time. I mean, the numbers today sound quaint. It's like $30 billion in bad debt. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket today. But back in 1960 or 1979, that was an enormous problem. In fact, they didn't solve really the Latin debt crisis until the early 90s. The issue of Brady bonds and tequila bonds and everything else. It was really a lingering problem where the Eurodollar system was, we got all this capacity, we got all this ability, what do we do with it? And so you had this period between 1980 and 1982, 83, where they kind of sat back and just let everything play out until it started to look like, okay, the economy is starting to recover certainly in the United States, 83 and 84. So back at it.
Right.
Except back at it in a very different way than it had been done beforehand, which is why you have more hyper asset financialization post great inflation than what you did in pre-great inflation.
So then does that get us into the savings and loan crisis in the 80s?
Absolutely. In fact, the funny thing is about the savings and loan crisis that people don't really realize is that it was exactly this. It was savings and loans, which are supposed to be these traditional mom and pop type depository institutions. But some of these mom and pop institutions got to be kind of big through, some strategic mergers. And then they got jealous. They looked at all of these global commercial banks, these larger banks, especially in the operating the Eurodollar system, and said, I want to be that too. They're making all this money, making money. How do I do that? And the savings and loans, the ones that adopted that wholesale Eurodollar balance sheet approach, they're the ones that ended up by 1985 and 86 creating the savings and loan crisis because they got themselves in over their heads. And a lot of it had to do with bad repo collateral, believe it or not. Especially a couple of the SNLs in the early crisis period essentially were defrauded by bad collateral. But the idea is they wanted to adopt this new model, this evolutionary model that commercial banks around the world had done. But that was not a really good idea because they had no expertise and no real depth in trying to do those things and try to adopt this Eurodollar system in a domestic S&L type safe depository industry that was just unsuitable for it. So that's really what the S&L crisis came from, was, again, this transition between the old way and the new way.